Hi everyone. Hi in the back. How are you doing? Did you guys get some food? It was so good. I wouldn't cry. Anyway, I'm here to talk to you about design systems. So here's me on the web. My name is Una, like unicorn. That's why I like to use a little unicorn for you to remember. I'm a Google developer expert, which means that I work with this program of people who like to give talks and to teach. I also am a co-host of a podcast called Tools Day, which is on every other week. It's a 20-minute podcast about tech tools, tips, and tricks. And like you heard, I'm the director of product design at Bustle Digital Group, which is a digital media company that has a couple of different websites that we oversee. But I also worked at Watson at IBM, Bluemix at IBM, and at Digitalocean. And what do these three things have in common other than the color blue in their logo? Design systems. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Design systems are so hot right now. The discussion around design systems has only increased over time. And modularization of code and components has gone hand in hand with the modularization of design elements in our UIs. So it's allowed us to think about web development in a more systematic way. In fact, it's how we have to think about web development in 2018 in order to keep up. Keeping your components modularized helps you to keep them up to date with changing frameworks and technologies, as we just heard about from Alex. And you can see a lot of these different systems popping up. Here are some from some bigger teams that are doing really important work in the field of design systems and scalable systems. And those include Polaris, there's Carbon Design System, there's the Lightning Design System. These are from big companies like IBM, Atlassian, and Salesforce. And if you are interested in this topic, there's two really good resources. Styleguides.io is a great resource that has blog posts, examples, a lot of different things for you to look at for inspiration or ideas. And then also there's this URL by Alex Pate, Awesome Design Systems. That's just a GitHub repo that's full of some great resources and links. If you're into anything like React, you just go to awesome-react or search for that on GitHub, and it's usually a curated list of links for you to find. So there's one for design systems. So let's start from the top. What exactly comprises a design system? Design systems can be a style guide or a visual pattern library. They can be design tooling. It can be a component library, the code components, or it can be the code usage guidelines and documentation about how to write the code itself. It can be design usage documentation, when to use the components visually, an animation language, or even voice and tone guidelines. And we'll go through these things. So let's start with the first one, which is a style guide or visual pattern library. Now, this dates back to whenever design started becoming something that we print in books. This is a little project that I did in college where we had to create a visual identity or rebrand for a company. And in the US, there's a company called Edible Arrangements that sends like these flowers of fruit to wherever you want them to be sent to. And I decided to pick this. So we also had to create a style guide for this. And I decided to do it online. So this is a little website I made with the brief, the logo usage, typography, sizing, where you should be including things on text, in print, where they can go. There's the type, there's the headers, web layouts, colors, all the fun things that we like to see, including characters, icons, patterns. All of these things comprise a visual pattern library, and you don't need these things for the web, but now that our products have become digital, we can translate these things into the web. So we're starting to see a lot of that. It's also design tooling. So this is like a sketch library or a layout. Primer from GitHub has an example of this where they have all their iconography, some examples of UIs like buttons, form layouts, and colors so that designers can open this file and use it to create layouts and new products that people are ideating about on GitHub. They just created a new feature on GitHub, for example, where you can suggest changes on pull requests, which is an awesome feature. And so they can use some of these existing patterns they have in Sketch and start using that to think about workflows. They have a series of assets for them where they can now take these and really easily move forward with it. It's also a component library, and what I mean here is that it's actual production code assets that you'll be using in your products. So here's an example from Float, which is a design system from Digitalocean that I was working on, where we have this website that has all of our logos, navigation, interactive components, what these look and feel like when you open them up, and also all of the events that you can use with them, how you can hook onto them, how you can interact with those events, and all of these things for developers for actually using those components in their UI. It's also code usage guidelines and documentation. And I think that the best example of this is the Airbnb JavaScript style guide. Who here has heard of the Airbnb JavaScript style guide? Yeah, a lot of us developers have seen this or used it, and you can use it in a couple of ways. You can use it with ESLint. This is a configuration tool that you can apply to your what's it called, like VS Code, whatever you use to write your code. And there's also a stylelint config, which is for CSS. So you can do this for both JavaScript and CSS, and even write your own configurations on top of this. So you can create an idea with your company, a solution for how you want to write your JavaScript or style it, and your CSS, and implement it. Or you can use something like Airbnb's style guide. And I think that this is also part of what is a design system, because it's how you architect your code. It's how you work with your team. There's also design usage documentation, how you use different components in the design system. I love this example from Carbon where they talk about drop-down menus. They describe when to use a drop-down, but then they get into the details of when to use what type of drop-down. So they describe this filter drop-down, and they say, when a list contains more than 25 items, use filtering to help find options from the list. And that's a great way for developers who might not have designers on their team to know what components to use at what place, when it's appropriate to use certain components, and when they should be using variations of those components. So having this kind of documentation is great for when you have a design library that is used by a lot of different engineers, like we were doing at IBM. They also go into general guidelines. I love this piece about loading. The waiting experience is a crucial design opportunity. Although it may be obvious what's occurring on the back end, we can communicate clearly to the user to reassure that progress is happening. This increases trust with your users and improves your perceived performance. Having usage guidelines also increases trust due to uniformity of the product. It feels more cohesive and professional, even though multiple teams of developers are working on the product. And next, this brings me to an animation language. So I'm going to talk about Carbon again, because I think they do a really interesting job of this. IBM actually looks into their own history to draw inspiration for how elements interact on their web page. So they have this website that they talk about orientation, awareness, navigation, storytelling, the reasons behind interactivity on the web, the reasons behind interactivity within their products. And then they look in their history. So this IBM 729 magnetic tape is what inspired that loading screen. They have a drawer animation, like when you have like a chat come out from the side, or a menu coming in from the side, where they look at inspiration from their own IBM Executive Electric typewriters. And I think that this is a really great example of looking for inspiration outside of the web. You know, like stop getting inspiration for your website from somebody else's website. There's more in this world to get us inspired for. And I think design systems are a great place to inject that creativity and that inspiration, because they are the foundation and the building block of your products. So the last thing on this list of what a design system can be is voice and tone guidelines. And for this, I will turn to MailChimp, who does a great example of this when they talk about what is the voice of their product. And they have an entire content style guide devoted to voice and tone. In their style guide, they say it's easier to describe what they're not instead of what they are. So they do both. They're fun, but not silly. They're confident, but not cocky. They're smart, but not stodgy. Informal, but not sloppy. They're helpful, but not overbearing. Expert, but not bossy. And weird, but not inappropriate. That's my favorite one. Tone is how they're saying something, whereas voice is what they were saying. So when they describe their tone, they say MailChimp has a sense of humor. You know, they're weird, but they're not inappropriate. So feel free to be funny when it's appropriate and when it comes naturally to you. But don't go out of your way to make a joke-forced humor, which can be worse than that at all. If you're unsure, keep a straight face. So this comes from styleguide.mailchimp.com. But they also have voiceandtone.com, in which they go deeper into this voice and tone guide. And they talk about how to say things in different situations. And this is my favorite example. They talk about what happens in a failure situation. So this is a failure message. The user is saying, what went wrong? I really need to get this campaign out. They're stressed out about this. MailChimp is a mail client, if you don't know. So this is somebody who's trying to get a campaign out to their users. And the user is feeling confused, stressed, and angry. So some tips that MailChimp offers is to first offer a solution or next step. To be straightforward, explain what's going on right away. Be calm. Don't use exclamation points or alarming words like alert or immediately. And then be serious. Don't joke around with people who are frustrated. So they also give a sample response. We're experiencing a problem at one of our data centers. Our engineers are on the case, and we will have things back to normal shortly. I love this example because now they have a way to communicate with their users which is uniform across the company. And that's something that we should all think about and include in our design systems. So I apologize for this really bad stock photo image here. But who here has ever started a fitness plan in their life? You're like, I'm going to get healthy. Yeah, that's right. Who here, keep your hands raised, has successfully finished that fitness plan like you were planning to? It's like a joke, right? There are so many reasons that a fitness plan can fail, but there are even more reasons that a design system can fail because they involve so many other people. It's not just yourself. And I think that there are a lot of correlations that we can make here. So let's define what it means for a design system to fail for the purpose of this talk. So what do I mean when a design system fails? I mean that nobody uses it. This is the primary factor. Who is using the design system? Is it helping people do their job? Are the goals of the system being achieved? And if nobody is using it, then how are those goals being achieved, right? So I also want to take you on a little story back in time to my last job at Digitalocean. And this is what happened. When I was at Digitalocean, there were a few different design systems floating around at different stages of completion. So first, when I joined, there was a Buoy version 1, and that was the logo there. And then as I was joining, they were starting to build a design system called Float to live with Buoy v1. And then by the time I left, we decided to build a new design system called Buoy also, but BUI, because it could stand for Better UI System. But then we didn't realize it was like the same name as the other one, and it was very confusing. So pro tip, don't name things the same, even if they're different. And so now we had 3 design systems, and I just want to remind you of a very poignant XKCD comic at this time. How standards proliferate. Situation, there are 14 competing standards. 14, ridiculous. We need to develop one universal standard that covers everyone's use cases. Yeah, soon. Situation, there are 15 competing standards. So that first design system was created for the product, so the dashboard, the cloud control application. At DigitalOcean, it's a company that lets you manage servers, SSD clouds, essentially. So that was for the user to manage their cloud. And then that second website was for marketing. And then that third website was to bring it all together under one happy umbrella, right? But why did we do that? The problem was that people weren't using the design system that they already had. And I'm talking about the first system. So that had been existing, and I wanted to know what was really going on behind the scenes. So I did a little bit of an audit. When I did an audit, I found that 96 kilobytes of the existing CSS was the design system. And that's pretty big, but this was only 28% of the total CSS, signaling that most of the CSS was overrides and additional components. People were overriding the system instead of actually using it. I know that you can't read this, but just don't worry about it. It talks about the specificity and the length of some of these selectors that we found. Yeah, these were all selectors that people had written. That's what overriding looks like. There were 57 unique font sizes, 14 Z indices, 121 unique color declarations, and 5 brand colors, 19 unique font family declarations, and we only used 2 fonts. So there was room for improvement. But most importantly, I wanted to know why people were adding on to the system and not using the existing system. And I think that understanding that, why people are not using your system, is critical to the discussion of how to empower a company to grow while using these design systems. That's why we build them. Happy design systems scale good standards. They build in accessibility from the start. They unify component style and code. They reduce code cruft, and they speed up product delivery. These are good things. This is the happy path. So if you're wondering, how could developers not use a design system that already exists when there are so many benefits? The answer is very simple. The answer to why they're not using it is simple, and it's that we're all being judged on different metrics. Most people aren't being judged on writing clean code. They need to build features and push updates. Their job depends on that. So you have to separate the fact that if you're working on design systems and your goal is to write really clean code and have a very performant, accessible website, that's not somebody else's goal. So figuring out how you can support your customer, which is the developer on your team, and their needs is not an easy task. Finding out how you both can get your needs filled is the main goal of successful design systems. So let's start looking at what we should be doing to have a successful design system. And the first thing is investment in this. And this really lives on the organizational level. It's like working out. Small incremental changes lead to big gains overall. And that's why I think to have a successful design system, you really need to make a continuous effort to invest resources into it. If you invest once in a design system, say you spent 3 months overhauling your entire design system, you built a really nice system, but then you don't have a team to keep it up anymore, you neglect to keep it up, you won't find much improvement after that immediate gratification. People will stop using it as it becomes out of sync with new designs, and you'll end up with strange floating bits of code living in your code base that are being overridden. And then you'll find yourself in for another large round of investment. You better round that team up and create the design system team again. But now they're dreading going through this process because it's fallen so far out of shape. So that's why it's so important to continuously invest resources into it. Also, because of how they scale, design systems can make a really large impact across the platform, making it extremely important to invest in things like accessibility from the bottom up. And to ensure this, having some kind of ownership is really helpful, like having some kind of team, if you can, or a person who's really looking out for this and advocating for the design system. Having a dedicated person is a way to make sure that this investment is ongoing and to show that investment. You want to have a really solid base for your design system. I wouldn't recommend doing this. I'm more like this person. I don't always exercise, but when I do, I'll do it tomorrow. But that image also brings me to my next point, which is that you really just have to start. And you have to start with getting buy-in. Getting buy-in or resources so that your team can work on it, showing this business value, showing the case. In order for a design system to succeed, you really need to get support all the way up and down the line, from product management to design to engineering to the people who are paying the salaries. It's a lot of people ops. You really want to make people want to use your design system because that's when you can really win. And a good way to make somebody want to use it is to show that it's the path of least resistance and to show its value. And one way to show its value is to do audits before and after using your system and implementing it. So to get started with that, the first thing to think about is your goal. What is your goal of having the design system? What's the point? Having a goal or a few goals with measurable metrics that you can use to persuade your company to give you resources to work on the design system or continue working on it is key. So what is your goal? Is it to improve website speed? Is it to improve accessibility of your site? Is it to reduce code cruft, increase prototyping speed, or even reduce UI bugs and inconsistencies? All of these are really good goals for design systems, and design systems can solve all of these problems, or at least improve issues that you may have with these topics. If your goal is to increase your speed of your website, webpagetest.com is a really great example of this. You can audit your performance before and after implementing it. So I have side-by-sides of the website that we had up before creating the design system and then after. And the top is this previous website for the Digitalocean.com marketing site before we introduced our design system. And the load time was almost 2 seconds slower than after we introduced the design system. And that's because we cleared out a lot of that CSS cruft. We also increased the speed index by like 2,000 points. We did a lot of improvement, and we had these results and numbers that we could then show the people who were making decisions about salaries. If your goal is to improve accessibility, then there's a great website called webaim.org that you can go and just profile your site, and it'll tell you where you have color problems or you're using ARIA wrong, like all of these things. It'll just automatically run through and show you. Here's just another example of using that. Like green is really hard. I don't know if y'all have like been building design systems with the color green and buttons, but it's not accessible. It's very hard to make green accessible in terms of web standards. Another thing that I did was create a little Pally dashboard, and I wrote a blog about it at una.im/pallydash, where we were able to set up a server that was continuously polling the accessibility errors on our site. And when we started to implement the design system, we saw that the errors and warnings went right down. And we had this like little piece of history and information that just lived in a little server that we were running, where you could see the impact of this. And it was pretty great. If your goal is to reduce CSS cruft, check out cssstats.com. The old website had like 2,500 more rules than the new website. We were able to reduce all of those like weird font sizes and Z indices and really get our code to be a lot cleaner. And now we had numbers behind it. We had like 80 shades of gray. And so to fix this, what we did was have a color workshop where I gathered all the designers, and then we cut out all those colors, and we decided which ones we were going to keep and which ones we were going to nest under each other. So we ended up getting it down to like 5 shades of gray and like 4 core colors by deciding what's our blue, what's our red, what's our green, what's our yellow, what's our dark, middle, and light gray. Like deciding where those go and then updating the UI by getting rid of a lot of these colors and seeing if it looked okay. This is like constantly checking because you might not have picked the right color for a certain area. This takes a lot of like give and take. Showing is more powerful than telling. So if you can, show the stakeholders the impact that your design system can have or has had. Use the metrics that you've gathered. Does it improve performance? Does it reduce UI inconsistencies? Does it improve accessibility? Is it easier to work with than what exists now? That's also a really important one. And then show the developers those benefits too. It's not just the CEO of your company or the CTO. It's also the people who are going to be using this. If you can, have your engineers use your product in a low-stakes situation where they can clearly see the benefits for themselves. I love hackathons for this. I think hackathons are like candy to a budding design system. They're a great place to debut the system. If you have a hackathon at your company and you're working on a design system, consider being just a design system advocate for that time. And go around to different teams and teach them how they can use it or help them to build something, help them build a UI by using your system. Or just evangelize for that system. That way you can see what people are struggling with, and that helps you to make changes to your design system. That's like excellent user testing right here. Get user feedback from the people who had used it after the hackathon or during. And the feedback that we got was actually really positive, and it helped the team kind of feel good about ourselves. So just in Slack, people were saying they felt like it was an unfair advantage to use the system. They felt like it was a boon. And that was like a great thing when you're building and building and building something and you haven't had anyone try it out yet. And then finally people have used it. And it wasn't all positive. We got a lot of really great feedback about like layout and what people had wanted in the system too. After the hackathon, more people had heard about Buoy and the word spread. Even people who didn't use it during the hackathon, they now knew it existed because people were talking about it. And this is one of my favorite moments that happened a few weeks after this hackathon. So somebody had, without like letting us know, decided, I wonder what happens if I replace Bootstrap with the design system that our company had built. And so they did that, and they were able to delete 20,000 lines of code, and they just had to write 60 lines of custom code. So these kinds of moments where people explore on their own are where you can really get people on your side to use your design system, to see the benefits firsthand, and to see how they help the products scale and grow. And speaking about scaling and growing your design system, the next thing I want to talk about is communication. A lot of why a design system is successful is due to communication. I Googled for some pictures of communication on the web, and this is what I got. Some weird photos. Like, this is not communication. This is like being talked at. This is like mansplaining. I don't even know. This isn't like the best image of communication, but it shows that communication should include as many people as possible. Once you have the resources and plan to invest in a design system, it's really important that this team or this person who is really pushing for the system acts as a bridge between design and engineering and product management. Continuous communication here is really important. Remember that nobody likes being told what to do or prescribed a solution, especially developers who are used to a lot of autonomy, like choosing your own tools at work, choosing what system you're using to write the code, what kind of computer you want. We don't, not every job gets that luxury. We get to pick our own tools, our own typefaces at work. There's a basic psychology here where people will just shut down and stop listening to you when you try to tell them what they should be doing. So despite how much control every individual engineer has on this process, they need to feel like they have input. They need to feel like they're heard. Even if they don't have input, make them feel like they're part of the process. And honestly, you should be listening to them because they probably have something valuable to say if they went to you and said that I have an opinion on this. It's like perceived performance in this case, except like perceived involvement. So ask, listen, make your users feel heard, and then incorporate that feedback. And I really want to emphasize this third point. Building design systems is a massive team effort, and it takes a lot of communication between design and development teams. You have to talk about what's the ultimate visual source of truth. What is the usage for each component? When is the component inappropriate to be used in certain situations? What does the interaction look and feel like? How do the various states look? And then how does this component interact with others? Having this kind of constant back and forth is what makes for good product team discussion. And I really like pair designing. I love pair designing. I love sitting down with a designer and just going through it. Because if you don't do that, your developer is going to go off and do something and the designer is going to have opinions, or the developer is going to go off and do something and the designer is going to have opinions. But if you sit down together and just do it together from the start, then you're going to have a smoother experience than going back and forth. And so what I really liked from IBM is that they created this stats site, right, where they have the status. Once you've finished your version 1 of your design system, people will start to use it and hopefully love the system, and then they'll want all of their personal needs componentized. So if somebody is building a product, they need like a very specialized date picker. They want to put that on this system that you've just built, but maybe that's not being used anywhere else. So you need somebody to kind of triage those component requests and make sure that these are base elements after all, that they're being used in more than one place. And then to manage the addition of all those new components. So what they've done here is they've shown you the component, the version number that's on, the status of that component, if it's updated or new. Somebody requests a certain type of dropdown, they can follow along here. You don't have to keep communicating specifically with that person. You can communicate with everyone who's using your system. So despite the status of your components, you can still show your audience what you're working on, those states, and use semantic versioning for consistency and understanding. And that brings me to my next point, which is a solid architecture. Build it so that it can grow, not colliding with existing styles, and also build it with composable molecules. Primer is an example of doing this. So they have a core package, which has base, box, breadcrumbs, buttons, forms, layouts, navigation, things that are used across their marketing site and also their core product, which is github.com. And then in github.com, they are using alerts, they have avatars, they have markdown, popovers, subhead support. These things don't exist on their marketing website, which is just like a, hey, join GitHub, or maybe some other website that GitHub might want to use. But they have a different type of marketing buttons, which is a separate package. They have a separate package for marketing typography, or page headers, or sections, a different type of package for support and for tables. So it's kind of like what we were thinking about when I was working at Digitalocean and building a design system, where we had our core variables, colors, sizing, font assets, icons were separate. Also, we had a style lint, so the style rules that we were using to write our CSS that we would then pull into our libraries. And then we'd have separate utilities, grid, our vendor libraries that we were using for like validation and those sorts of things. Our components, and then also the site was built in Ember at the time, so a separate library for that. And then all of these would be pulled into the documentation site, ticketing site, API site, the dashboard. Having these all separate allowed us to have a design system that was used for different things and not override the code for each of these core use cases. So these were all just different modules that we then pulled in. When it comes to building the actual components themselves, decide on the base and then start small. So, there's buttons, the hello world of design systems, but there's also so many states for the buttons, and all of those states have different interactions. So, think about you get small buttons, mini buttons, icons with text inside of buttons, icon buttons, full width buttons, a reset utility for something that's like a button but doesn't want to look like a button. So, you have to think about all the utilities for all these buttons, all those use cases, and then describe, when to use a link over a button. That's a big part of accessibility that people sometimes just gloss over. When to get the desired styles, all these things, like when and where do you use these types of buttons? And then once you have your base elements, you can then compose those to build out more complex components that are common throughout your UI. So this was an example of a split block with a drop-down. This uses a box, typography, icons, a form drop-down list, and little icons in there as well, so list with icons. And this is just building on some of the other components. You're pulling them in and making things out of these base elements. We also had these separate utility classes, which were really great when we were doing prototyping. So a thing that Google Chrome does is allows you to add a class, and you can see in here when you start typing, you can just see the changes inside of the browser Chrome itself, and that's awesome because here you can see all the different utility classes. You could see everything that you're sending in your style sheet, which is super useful because now I work in a React system, and that was funny that it did that. I work in a React system, and the class names are all -34921. But if you start typing, it'll find the beginning of that name, so you could still use styles that are being used in that UI itself, and still prototype in the browser. So having these separate utility classes, thing that you can also kind of prototype with. Loaders are a great example of interaction, also to mention in the design system, how these loaders interact with the content. Where do they exist on the page? When do they exist on the page? Are they inline? How do they look in sidebars? How do they look in carousels? How do they look inside of cards? There's a lot of different things to consider here. Do you have a horizontal versus vertical loader in some places? And then do we include layout in the design system? This is something that people still aren't really sure about. They haven't really decided a yes or no answer on this. And then if you do include layout, to what extent do you include that layout? I really like this article by Nathan Curtis who talks about layout in design systems, and he talks about grid versus space. So, the components themselves having a space attached to them, but not necessarily creating a specific grid for your user. Now, this is something that we got feedback on when I was working at Digitalocean, and a common piece of feedback was we just want layouts. So we ended up including layouts as a piece of the design system, just examples of layout, because people were doing some prototyping there, and they didn't have designers in their teams. But that's definitely up to you. Not a lot of design systems that are out there do include layout, but they'll have space included in the components and how those should feel and look in a grid aligned with each other on the page. So it's just a discussion to have with your team. And then semantic versioning has been really important. I've used semantic versioning on all of the design systems that I've ever worked on. Semantic versioning uses a system of major.minor.patch for any updates. So if there's a patch update, if you fix a bug that wasn't really affecting any other components, then you would update that patch. If it's a minor change where maybe you change or you add a new component, that might be a minor change, whatever you decide. A major change would be a breaking change, something that visually changes. If you change your primary button from blue to brown, that's a major change. If people had just been using the latest version of the system, they'd notice. If the layout changes or if the size of that button changes, it could break layouts. So when we did this, we now had a number, a tagged version, on every iteration of the release of that design system. And it went with this system, with this versioning naming system. And we were able to also link that number to our sketch assets. So the designers in the team were building a sketch library at the same time, and they were updating based on the semantic versioning to keep that up to date with what we were seeing on GitHub. And then every time we made a release on GitHub, we were building docs. We were building a CDN file, a file that we then served in our CDN, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And we were able to create a folder of files for every single version that ever existed. So if somebody wanted to use an older version of the design system, they could either point it to an older version of this on GitHub, which would be a node module, or they could use a static file that we generate for every version update if they wanted to include a link. And that was the way that we made sure that your UI didn't break unless you were prepared for it to. It didn't automatically update. It updated when you told it to. And that was really important for things to not be broken because things are constantly changing. If you don't namespace your system, you might get collisions. This is something that I learned in the example that you saw earlier where it was like showing like button dash dash large. That's not the right thing to do. I ended up adding prepending like the name of the design system to everything that I had been building. So this happened at Bluemix. We called it BX dash. At Digitalocean, we did buoy dash. Be sure that you namespace. So I will say that in the systems that I was building at those times, it was like a CSS or a Sass-based system. Now you can do things like CSS and JS or CSS modules, which I really like, and that does it for you. When you're tying these classes into those components in JavaScript, either by having them live close to each other or inside the file itself, and then importing them into that file directly. If you're using a system like that, you're namespacing. So that's great. You can tie them together with these JavaScript frameworks. But if you're not doing that, make sure that you're using namespacing manually to make sure that somebody else doesn't create a class called button large, and now you have these collisions happening. And that brings me to tech stack choice. And for this, I just wanted to show you what some other companies have been doing. This is an example from BuzzFeed. So they're also a digital publisher. In their design system, they use Sass, they use Atomic CSS, and they have a float-based grid. They have no JavaScript in their system. I don't know if this is like the best design system, but I do want to show this as an example because they don't have JavaScript. So even if you don't have like strong JavaScript developers in your team, if you're not using React or any other component-based framework, you can still build an effective design system that people are using, and then that can grow into something that uses like React if you're using that, or Vue, or Ember, or whatever your developers need. The JavaScript can be built on top of that, but if you have the resources to create this in CSS and HTML, that's really useful as well. They also have a sketch template. With Carbon, they have Sass. They use BEM for naming convention, no specified grid. They have examples using React and vanilla JavaScript, and also Angular now. And they have a sketch template, design documentation, and voice and tone guidelines as well. And AtlasKit by Atlassian is fully bought into React. This is a React-based system. They just use CSS and JS, and that works for them because their entire product is built in the system. But you really have to think about your product and how it's built and the use cases for this. So when I was at Digitalocean, we wanted to do a couple of things. And our system was built to be used with vanilla JavaScript and also to be imported into Ember. So we weren't using things like Storybook, which is great if you're having a React-based application, and then you can just build things in a component-based way. So things that we wanted to do was to have easily customizable components using a hook system. We had a flexible system that built in media queries with class names. And we wanted to have a really performant output. So that was kind of like the goals of this, like these three tenets. So one way that we did that was, this is using Sass. So we used hooks. We had this like mix-in hook button that let you pull all of the base styles from this default button, but then add onto it. So here we have a new file with our customized buttons. We have a variable that gives us the color of this pink button. And then we're able to call this hook and then add this and dash dash pink, which means that we get buoy dash button dash dash pink, and style that. And then it's hover and active state, which we used a class for the active state, and we used a hover pseudo class for the hover. And so we were able to do this without having to copy all that code, rewrite it. And now if you're doing this in something that's like a React-based system, you can import those styles as well, and then add on top of them, build on top of those. So the options are endless. Another thing that was kind of interesting is how we used these media queries. So we made these components that were very flexible, that you were able to adjust with just the class name, and they changed based on the size of your viewport. So this is kind of what it looked like, where we have a class here, and it's just buoy block grid 4 at small, and it starts with them all lined up because we have this 12-column grid. And then when it hit the small size, because we were designing mobile first, it turned that block grid into a 4-by block grid. And we were able to do this just with class names. So that was something that was really appreciated. We were able to just like sort of build in responsive design. And developers liked it. There were also people that built a new website after we had created a website, and they used the design system. They really liked this for their own use, and that was nice to hear. And then also we wanted to make sure that we had a really performant system. So again, the solution might not be the one for you, but with Sass, we had this list of components, and if you included your component in this list, then it would appear in the code that was generated, the CSS that was generated from this system. If you didn't, then it wouldn't appear. So you only got the code that you needed. Now, if you're using something like React, again, React is very popular, and that's what I'm using now at work, so I have opinions on this. If you're using React and code splitting and all those great best practices for front end, and you're using CSS modules or CSS and JS, this will happen for you. It'll only spit out the code that appears in your page. So keeping in mind this performant aspect is really important part of design systems, but you can do it in any way. If you're using vanilla CSS or Sass, this is one way to do it as well. So it just really depends on your own needs. And the last point that I will talk about is reducing friction, which kind of sums up all the other points I've made here about empathy, communication, and thinking about your user when building a design system. You have to make your design system the path of least resistance, and that means lowering cognitive overhead and not adding to it. If a new design system is harder to use than the current system, people won't use it. And this could impact some of the decisions that you make. If your design system is complicated and over-engineered, again, it's not going to be used. And that's definitely something that I learned. So we went in with like guns blazing, with this approach, with this like list that you can include, and like making things really performant, and using this hook-based system to create these really easy to build components that you build on. And people can implement this in their development process and use Sass and just select all these things. And the code is really clean, and the design systems team is happy. But not everybody wanted to work this way. If you weren't already using Sass, why would you include it in your code base? If you weren't wanting to do that, then you were just creating some kind of cognitive overhead, some mess that you might not need to. So we also included the second option. And I mentioned that when we were using semantic versioning, we were building assets every time we put out a new release. And so this is just a link to jQuery, but it's the same idea where we would have the CDN that was a private file that people had a link to, and they could just include the icons, the CSS, and the JavaScript when they needed it in the head of their file. So if they were doing prototyping, this is a really popular approach for hackathons, things like that. And this made it easier for developers to use and still get some of the benefits of having that UI continuity, reducing those bugs. So learned this and definitely tried to make it as easy as possible for developers so that they would use it. The best time to build a design system is definitely while a product is evolving, but it can be built in retrospect as well. If you want to reduce friction, try to start early. Like there's no time like the present, but if you can't do that, definitely make a game plan for what happens. So any guesses of what this chart is? You got this red line that's like continuing to increase, and this blue line that goes down and then back up. You're not going to guess this. It's ridiculous. So this is the price of rent in New York over time. So even when renter income went down, housing prices still went up. I don't know why I lived there. But this is also a great example of bugs, craft inconsistencies if your code over time and care is given. As bugs increase, you might care less and less over them, and it's going to be hard to really want to go in and squash those bugs after a point. But a way to reduce this is to make sure there's mechanisms in place. Make sure that you're constantly revisiting the code, constantly revisiting that system, and ensuring the code quality doesn't go down over time. We don't want those bugs to go up over time. And starting earlier will help you reduce this friction. So if you're already working with a system that's full of spaghetti code, you're just going to have to go in there and get it done, and then make sure that doesn't happen again. And it also helps to have a dedicated resource for this, to have people helping developers to implement the system and get the most out of it. Give users support and listen to their frustrations and not only help them out, but also solve their problems so that the next person doesn't have the same problem and you're not repeating this circle of process over and over again. Make sure that people aren't running into the same challenges and that you're actually fixing those things to start with. Everything here is very intertwined. And so I think like investment, communication, buy-in, having a solid architecture, reducing friction, these are all extremely important things for having a successful design system. These are some of the technical things that you need. And people ops is very technical. But on top of this, like continuous iteration, support, and communication are even more important. These are the most important factors to design system success. Code is only 10% of it. Design is only 10% of it. People ops is 80% of the work of building a design system. And remember that slide from the beginning? I just want to remind you here that there are different solutions for different teams. Different needs, different solutions. We can't compare our 5-person design team to someone else's 300-person design team, or our 1-person design systems team to another company's 12-person dedicated design systems team. And this is where I have a controversial opinion. As somebody who's spent the last like 3.5 years of her life working on design systems, and that is that you might not need a design system. If cost is greater than benefit, you might not need a design system. And what I mean by this is you can't be the sole advocate for a design system. You can use data to convince people of why a design system is important and how it will benefit your product, but you can't be the only one rooting for this system. You can't be the only one or else it's not going to work. You're going to run into a case where you've built a system, spent your time on it, and nobody's using it. So make sure that you get the support if you really believe in this. And this brings me back to my gym metaphor. Not everyone enjoys the same workout, but you can get the same results if you do something that's more tailored to your needs. You know, running isn't right for everyone, but maybe swimming is right for you. BEM might be right for someone else, and CSS and JS might be right for another person. The best design systems are evolved from your personal needs, not from someone else's examples. So take the time to really examine those needs, find what's right for you, and keep at it. Thank you.
First of all, thanks a lot for the talk. Very insightful and very educative. I have 3 questions. The first one would be, you mentioned Ember somewhere along the way. Did you have positive experiences or negative experiences with that? Negative, okay.
I think Ember is great in terms of convention over configuration, but I felt like it was limiting. And I prefer having a system that I can pick the plugins. So those are my thoughts on Ember.
Okay. Number 2 would be, if you think of the biggest web or digital-oriented design system you've worked on or worked with, a larger company where you've tried to implement it, perhaps IBM or something like that. And if you would, let's say I'd insist that you implement a design system for the web, and you're only allowed to use CSS. Would that be possible? Could you do that, or how much of a compromise? How much percentage of the design system you ended up building could you build just using CSS and maybe a CSS model like object-oriented CSS or BEM or SMAX or whatever?
I think that you could do a lot with CSS and HTML. You can do a lot with ensuring accessibility and those sorts of things with static elements. But I think that it's very, very limiting. You can make like a visual style guide, kind of what I was showing in the beginning with like typography and colors and like buttons and basic elements. But you lose a lot of components. So form validation, you lose interactivity. What do drop downs look like if you're making a custom drop down? You can't do that with CSS. There's so many elements that really require JavaScript. Like one of our elements was a code block that you can copy, press copy, and it copies to clipboard. Those things you can't just do with CSS. So I think it is very limiting. I think you can still have a base if that's all the resources that you have, but it's really hard to create something for the web today that's just HTML and CSS.
Okay, thanks. Third question, where can I get the slides?
I think that we are sharing them. We're sharing them.
We're sharing them on meetup.com? Are you going to share them on meetup.com? What? SlideShare. And where can I get the link?
Okay.
Where can I get the link?
For hafentalks. Hafentalks social media channels, which is Twitter and Facebook.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Email a
I don't
friend.
use Facebook.
Twitter.
Sorry to disappoint you. Any more questions?
Okay, this is a question from way behind. You don't see me, but one question. When we have users, I mean, they have like a biography of learning interactions over time. I mean, I'm always a Windows guy, and I have learned a lot of interaction within Windows systems. So what is your question about these cognitive patterns that are burned into my nerve cells, into my brain? What is your answer shifting these patterns or interaction patterns into your design approaches?
I think that's such an interesting question. So the first thing I'll say is don't make things complicated for your user. Use existing patterns they expect to have on the web. Like don't scroll jack. If you're expecting to scroll down when you're scrolling, people are doing that for a reason. There's also accessibility things that can get messed up if you try to change how your user is supposed to be working on the web. Like the web has so many built-in features that are there for a reason. However, if you have a good reason to change those patterns, then you can do just that, and you should definitely user test. I think a great example of this is Apple. Like the iPhone, when they decided, oh, we don't want a button anymore, they had to create an entirely different way to interact with the phone. And I think people were frustrated at first. Like, I have an iPhone 10, and I had so much trouble like the first 2 days using it, like swiping out instead of pressing that little button to get the home screen up. That, to me, took a little bit of getting used to, but they had thought through these interactions, they tested them, and now when I use an older phone, like I don't know how to use that because my mind has adapted to this new UX technique. So I think it definitely depends. I wouldn't create patterns with no reason, but if you have to do it, then be mindful about it. Over here.
Yes, the first kinds of design systems were very developer-driven, and the actual systems are developer-driven too. There are some systems evolving where you can get sketch files out of code files, and vice versa. But something that we still need, I think, is a system where a designer can use code and create new web pages. Do you know any system which provides us with this?
Okay, I have a lot of thoughts on this too. I think that there's a lot of companies that are working on this. There's like Envision, the design system company that is trying to make it so that you can, design things and then export them to code. I don't think that there's anyone that's out there right now that's doing it in an effective way, that's not creating like really crazy output. There's some sketch plugins. For me, I think it really depends on how you define design. I'm a designer, but I also code. So I feel like I can make design systems. When I was working at Digitalocean, we were working with designers who didn't know how to code, but it was very design-driven, where they would, if there was like a redesign or an update, it would be something that we'd work on together, and there would be those preliminary meetings where, as a developer, I'm like, that's easy to do or that's not easy to do. That's like a lot of lift or not. And then they would go forward with design, and then we'd implement that into the new version of the design system. So I do think it is design-driven. I think that the earliest design systems were like NASA and were before the web. So I still think that this is a very design-thinking approach. I think developers got interested in this because of performance and because of solving for a way to effectively build on the web in a well-designed format. Like Bootstrap was a great example of something that gave developers power. It let developers build prototypes at hackathons that showed a point, and they didn't have to build everything from scratch. So I think that developers were critical in coining this term like component library, but designers are still a crucial part of what drives. Sorry, I need water. What drives design systems? Did that answer your question? The answer was there's not a solution, but I think it's okay.
Sure. Okay, got a question. Did you ever see a design system fail utterly, miserably, like really big time? And if so, what were the main reasons for that?
Well, I think the example I gave here, where like 2/3 of the code on the website was something people overriding the design system. I think that's pretty bad. Like, they made that site 2 seconds slower because they couldn't figure out how to use the system. So I don't know. I think that was an example where I was like, oh gosh, let's fix this now. Yeah.
Okay, we have one question here.
Again, thank you for your talk. But I have a question about two ideas and concepts that you didn't have a word about it. So I would ask you, what do you think about Brad Frost's idea of atomic design, and why didn't you say any word about it?
Brad Frost is great. I love his work. I think he's a great dude. Yeah, I mean, atomic design is another way to think about design systems. I think that in the ways that I've built and shown in this talk, you think about things atomically, where you think about your base molecules, and then you build that into like added layers. Like you start with molecules and create atoms. Like he has this really great biology analogy to how we build design systems. I think that's a part of it. That's definitely a part of it. And he has Pattern Lab, which is like a tool for building design systems. But it's, again, just like another solution, like any other thing we do. Okay. Sorry, I didn't mention it, Brad. No, don't get mad at me, Brad.
It's okay. We built a design system on his ideas and totally failed 2 years ago. So it's good. Maybe it's not always talk about him. And but the other concept. Do you know Alla Kolmatova's concept about purpose first? Or design system built on purpose first. And what do you think about that?
I'm not aware of that. What does that mean?
Okay, that you have every component, you order them to a purpose, and that you always try to focus that the component fulfills this purpose. And when you try to build like something like a website, that you have always think about which component you want to use, that you say which purpose that I want to succeed and which components then I have to use. So it's a very interesting concept from Alla, and we built our design system completely on these ideas. And yeah, it's currently on the, would say, on the position where we not sure about how will it fail or will it succeed. So I just want to hear what you think about this idea, but okay, it's no problem if you didn't hear about it. Maybe we can talk.
Sure. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. I mean, that sounds like cool. That sounds zen. That's a good way to design with having a purpose in mind. I don't know what to say.
I want to ask something about versioning. So we were saying that you version your components or your system semantically. Do you recommend like doing a version release for the whole system at once, or doing components like separately?
So that's a good question. So at IBM on Carbon, they did individual components because those components all had their own like repo, and by that I mean like they were all in their own folder that kind of existed as like its own purpose. And you can also release things like that. But at Digitalocean, we just had it all together to make it simpler. It was a much smaller team. So it just depends on your needs. I think it's easy to start and think of it as a system. And then once you're really adding components and making it more complex, you can start to think of it as individual components.
So were there cases where people wanted like a component from an earlier version and some other component from another version, or was that not working for you?
I don't think it really made a big difference, because if you want like the updated accordion, you probably should update your buttons too, you know? So I don't think it really makes a big difference. I would just version it all together.
Thanks.
Thanks, Una, for a great talk. And my question would be, I assume that you have to collocate your design system with your website, or what are the mechanisms to perform the updates? So if you change some design primitive on your design system, all the web pages which could be hosted somewhere should be updated, and other way around. If you need to change something on the page that doesn't fit, how do you keep consistency? What are the recommendations for available solutions for that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I was trying to get into some of this when I talked about like separating out your utilities, grid, different aspects of your design system and your system itself from the actual website. So the website will pull in the components from your design system, the colors, your buttons, things like that form. So if you update them inside of that repo, when you update your modules inside of your website and rerun it to rebuild it, then it'll get the new styles. So it kind of starts from the atoms, like the most primitive thing out.
Okay.
And then, you have to rebuild and redeploy, of course, but you're probably making updates every day anyway.
Okay, thank you.
We have a question over here.
Hi. So my question is really, where do you get your inspiration from to decide when a design is outdated and when to renew a design?
I think that's a business decision, and I haven't been involved in that. It's like, you need a reason to spend time on a redesign. So what is the purpose of that? Like where I work now, a redesign will drive more ad sales because companies will want to post content on a fresh, new-looking website. At Digitalocean, it was, our website's outdated, we want to get more clients, we want to get more customers, let's redesign it. So I don't think it comes from the developer or designer, I think it comes from like the marketing person or the person who's in charge of the product and who thinks like, okay, it's time to update this because A, B, and C.
That was it? So my turn? So thanks for your very honest talk. Sounds like design systems are like manuals nobody wants to read. But are there any alternatives? So you finished your talk so quickly. Is there anything between design systems and chaos that you can recommend?
Yeah, so where I work right now, it's a very small engineering team. We have to run a lot of different companies and sites within it. And so what we do is we use a very component-driven system where we have our buttons, our like carousels, and we pull them in a systematic way on our sites. We have them broken out, but we don't have like a website that says this is what a button looks like, this is what a carousel looks like. So I think that there is somewhere in between. I think right now, where we are in terms of development in 2018, it's really nice to have a organized system of components. And I think that what a lot of people do with having design systems with a website and a manual helps with that, especially with bigger teams. So it's really up to your needs. Like if you're using Preact and React and like creating things in a modular way, then you're already doing a lot of things that a system with laid out like descriptors and everything does for you. So it's definitely like a spectrum of chaos to organized chaos to organized components, I guess.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
So I saw Sketch quite a lot on the slides. So now then you have designers working in Sketch, some engineers working in CSS and JavaScript. How do you sync that and where's the point of truth?
That's really hard to decide. So what we were doing at DigitalOcean and at IBM is syncing it when you had any update to the design system. So like the designers would make the update to the buttons, or like that's just the basic example, I don't know. And then the developers would update the system to match that version of Sketch. So it would kind of go hand in hand. Right now, we don't have it all in Sketch. Like every time we have a new update, we have to create a site. That being said, all of our websites look like different, and they all have different use cases and needs. So we would have to just like spin up a new thing every time anyway. If you're working on the same product and you have the same dashboard and you have the same system over a long period of time, I think it definitely makes sense to have a Sketch library that you're updating and using and reusing to make your products. If you have like a website that has different pages and is just like has things like that don't get reused in other places, then you might not have one.
Thanks.
I have a question regarding accessibility, for example, for a disabled person. What is your system in developing accessibility, and how much effort do you regularly, based on your experience, put into it?
A lot. So, I mean, easy first things are color accessibility, making sure that you have the right component types, making sure that you have everything described if you're using JavaScript to build a component, like giving it an ARIA label or a state or whatever you need that way. The difficult thing is keyboard accessibility, like making sure you could tab through everything through keyboard. And that's another reason why I think that you can't really build a design system without JavaScript, because right now the web, if you're building a component that's like more than just base elements in the web, you have to use JavaScript to make it accessible, like with your keyboard. So this is like, you know, a baseline thing for design systems. And I think every design system should be focused on accessibility like from the start and then build on top of that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's another question coming from a background in eye-tracking research. Isn't the purpose of a design guide that we steer the awareness of the user? I mean, if you're coming on a website and you're looking for the basket to put your products in, so we are trying to optimize the information processing from recognizing where's the button, what kind of functionality is behind it, and what I can do, what intention the user is going to proceed. So wouldn't it be better to some kind of try to understand the patterns of the intention on a website, and then maybe recreate the interface in a more dynamic way. So if you don't see the button in, let's say, 2 seconds, why not offer this button in a more aware or more aware aspect, like blinking or things like that? What is your opinion on eye tracking and doing this research on tracking intention on interfaces?
Oh, if you can afford it, yeah, go for it. But I don't think a lot of companies can afford to get that kind of in-depth research. I think that's fantastic if you can. I think with things like blinking buttons and such, it gets really hairy because you also have people who like get nauseous from animations, things like that. Like you have to think about all of your users. I also think that this is a great example for having documentation about how to use animation on your design system, but not necessarily having like a solution that you must use. Like for example, if you are on a shopping website and you see some really cute shoes and you want to buy them, you click on them and you see them visually go into your cart, like that's an example of like keeping the user's attention and keeping them in a digital space. But you're not going to be able to showcase that in your design system because those are disparate components. But you can have a card for your product and you can have like a shopping cart layout, and then you can describe in the text what those two could interact like. And I think that the IBM examples are coming pretty close to that, where they talk about the intention of interaction, they talk about the intention of usability, but they don't have to like explicitly describe how things move towards each other, because those are two different base components or even complex components that you can use in different ways in your site.
Right, we'll take one last question.
Okay, so it's going to be a simple question. So thanks for the presentation. It was pretty nice. So I'm not a designer myself, but I'm a coder, so I'm really interested about all these fancy stuff and graphics, colors, and all these kind of nice things. So for enthusiasts, let's say, what could be simple out-of-the-box design system that I would just like try to scratch on from tomorrow, let's say?
Well, what are you using to build your site with? That's the first question I have.
Can you repeat?
Like, are you using a framework, or what are you building your application with?
Let's say like I'm open to something simple, just like give me this nice things that's happening. I'm a back-end developer, let's say, and I'm doing some stuff with mobile apps. So like the front-end world is not like my kind of thing. And then I feel like really good about this design systems and all this kind of stuff. So there should be something simple out of the box to let the people try with, rather than just, getting lost in all this kind of stuff.
I hear you. I think material design is a great customizable design system that has both web and mobile assets. So you might want to look into that. It's by Google. It's called Material UI. And they also have application called Material UI Next for React developers. So they have like a lot of different customization there. You can use their components. They have like things like date pickers, which are hard to make. Some really great interaction that's like Google-esque, but you can like choose your own themes. And they have a lot of tools for that. So I think that Material UI is kind of like becoming the new Bootstrap in the sense that people have this control. It's more customizable, but also it's easy to use and it spans a lot of different technologies. Thank you.